Hello and welcome to episode 3 of A Brit's Guide to Fantasy NFL. Today I will be explaining how to prepare for your draft. Maybe it's your first ever draft, or maybe you've just been overwhelmed every year so far and are ready to make a change. I'll start by explaining how the draft works, then move on to my advice about how to draft, signpost you towards a few of my favourite sources for rankings and analysis, and finally I'll break down some of the lingo that gets batted around at this time of year. The fantasy draft is of course a direct copy of the NFL rookie draft, but there are a few important differences. While the traditional American style fantasy draft is effectively a big party with a physical draft board, I recommend watching the first few episodes of The League to get an idea. It can be impractical to arrange a big meetup for your whole league, especially in our post-COVID world, so increasingly more and more drafts are held using the built-in online platforms. In your draft, you will typically have to pick 15 players. A quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, a flex position, a kicker, a defense, and 6 bench players that can be any combination of the above. I covered the positions in detail in episode 1, so please feel free to go back and check that out if you missed it or just want a recap. The draft is split into 15 rounds, with 1 pick per team in each round. Unlike the NFL draft, fantasy drafts operate a snake format. This means that the order in which teams pick flips each round, so that if you were to pick last in round 1, you'll pick first in round 2. This is known as being at the turn. Now, there are a lot of different ideas and opinions about how to draft, but I'll present to you just the most widely accepted approaches. The first and most important thing to know is that running backs and wide receivers are by far the most important positions to draft. You will need to have around 5 of each by the end of the draft, which by extension means you should only be drafting 1 each for all the other positions. You should certainly avoid burning your first round pick on a quarterback with a flashy name and stats. Most fantasy experts agree that even Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson should only be taken in the 3rd round. The reason for this is that the difference between these quarterbacks and the ones you can get much later in your draft, such as Carson Wentz or Matthew Stafford, is relatively low compared to the difference between, say, Ezekiel Elliott and Tariq Cohen at running back. The other half of this is that once the season is underway, there will be plenty of free agent quarterbacks playing bad defenses who you can stream from week to week with a greater degree of success than you might expect. The situation is a little similar for tight ends, however there is a clear drop-off after the top 4 or so. In my opinion, that's Travis Kelce, George Kittle, Zach Ertz and Mark Andrews for the current season, so taking one of those in rounds 2 to 5 is a perfectly valid strategy. It will be much harder to stream the tight end position week to week, although there are a number of late dart throw options such as Noah Fant or TJ Hockenson that have the potential to become as good as the top 4 mentioned above. You should leave drafting kickers or defences until the final 2 rounds. The advantage of having a top tier option at either position is minimal, and the positions themselves are unpredictable. Kickers are at the mercy of how the offense performs, while defensive units have too much turnover year to year to have reliable consistency from one season to the next. Instead, you should use those middle rounds to load up on depth at the running back and wide receiver positions. So to recap, running backs and wide receivers are your top priority. Quarterback and tight end should be left a little later, until around round 3 for the top options. Kickers and defences should always be left until the last 2 rounds. Now we have the overall strategy sorted, how do we handle each individual pick? One of the most tried and tested techniques for drafting successfully is called tier-based drafting. This involves sorting players at each position into tiers, where the difference in quality is minimal. For example, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley and Ezekiel Elliott might be your first tier, where there is then a clear drop-off to Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry or Clyde Edwards-Helaire in tier 2. There are plenty of experts' published tiers available for you to use and adapt. Now, armed with your tiers, what you do is to look across each position and see how many players are left available in the best tier at each position. If the pick comes to you and you have only Alvin Kamara left in your top running back tier, but 3 wide receivers in that top tier, tier-based drafting says you should take Kamara, since the chances that one of those top receivers is available next round is actually quite high, meaning you could end up with a top tier option at both positions. Obviously, as the draft goes on, you will need to consider the makeup of your team alongside this in order to make the best decisions for your roster. Just googling draft help, cheat sheets or strategy will bring up a vast plethora of options, and it can be quite overwhelming trying to work out what to use. My personal first stop is a website called fantasypros.com. They pull together the rankings of hundreds of experts to produce overall collated rankings. You can then sort through these by position and scoring formats to tailor it to your needs. My method is then to download those rankings into Excel, sort them by position and format them to be easier to read. From here you can either leave the rankings as they are or move players around based on your preferences. I also print out these sheets, and leading up to the draft I'll go through making notes about each player, doing a bit of research to fill gaps in my knowledge, and then be armed for the teeth, ready for my draft when I will cross out players as they are taken. If you have more time to put in before your draft, another great source of information is the Fantasy Footballers podcast. Andy, Mike and Jason managed to simultaneously be both hilariously entertaining and consistently ranked very highly among all experts in accuracy. Do check them out if you have the time. In reading or listening to draft analysis, you may hear a number of phrases repeated that maybe need a bit of explanation. ADP, or average draft position. This is the average spot in the draft at which this player is taken by all casual fantasy players. In combination with expert rankings, using these two sources of data together can tell you if a player can be had at a bargain. For example, Washington wide receiver Terry McLaurin is the 48th ranked player by experts, but his ADP is pick 62. Therefore, on average, you can get Terry McLaurin 14 spots, more than a whole round, later than where the experts believe he should be drafted. A bust is a player that experts believe will not deliver value at their draft position. That's not to say a player is absolutely bad, but for example, Todd Gurley may be considered a bust, as with his injury issues and on a new team, he's been drafted ahead of players in much more secure situations such as Chris Carson or Le'Veon Bell. A sleeper is a player experts believe is being overlooked in drafts who could give you enormous value. This quite often can be the second option on an offense, such as Michael Gallup, who is not quite as overshadowed by the number one option, Amari Cooper, than might be thought. Subtly different from a sleeper, a breakout is a player, usually relatively young, who experts believe could be about to have a big year that catapults him into fantasy relevance. A good example from last year was Ravens tight end Mark Andrews, who made a significant jump in his second year in the NFL. If there are any other unusual words or phrases that you would like explained, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching once again. Please like and subscribe. Next week, to prepare you for week 1, I will give you an overview of the fantasy week, what to do and when. In the meantime, good luck for your draft.